Hey, I'm Kate Wells. Michigan Public's Fall Member Drive begins September 15th, but you don't have to wait. If you received a letter or an email from us, please reply. Your support keeps trusted news strong. Donate at michiganpublic.org/donate.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
A Michigan judge dismisses charges against the so-called fake electors.
They were led to believe that their actions were a part of some legitimate political strategy.
The state Senate's lawsuit over the state House withholding 9 bills adopted in the last legislative session is in court.
It's unconstitutional. We cannot have a Michigan Constitution or a legislature where one guy just thinks he has the power to do whatever we want.
And 20 days to come up with a budget deal before the possibility of a partial state government shutdown.
The reality is that we need to find a multi-billion-dollar solution that's sustainable, that's not just a patchwork of a couple talking points.
Today, a Michigan politics roundup on the show because there is a lot going on. Let's turn to Beth LeBlanc, politics reporter at the Detroit News, and Clara Hendrickson, politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, to fill us in. Hi, you both.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so Beth, let's start with the so-called fake electors. A Michigan judge on Tuesday dismissed a group of 15 Republicans who back in 2020 had tried to submit themselves as presidential electors for Republican Donald Trump. This judge dismissed the criminal charges brought by Attorney General Dana Nessel. Before we get into the dismissal, can you just take us back to December 2020 in Lansing and what was going on that brought this issue in the first place?
Yeah, so at that time, there were still a lot of lawsuits active regarding the 2020 election. There were a lot of allegations that there was widespread fraud. Of course, different audits afterward showed that there was not. But there were a lot of people pretty upset about the 2020 election, and 15 Trump electors signed a certificate saying that Trump was the winner of the election. And that is what landed them in hot water with the attorney general and why she brought charges. And of course, the judge yesterday said, look, the charges that the attorney general brought require an element of intent, an intent to defraud. And the judge ruled that from the evidence presented to her, that these individuals appeared to believe that their signing of this document was an attempt to seek redress from the Senate, which was in part responsible for certifying some of these results. So that's basically like the nutshell of it, that the judge just felt that the AG didn't prove intent well enough. And that's what a lot of this hinged on.
Clara, what are the political implications of this Judge Kristen Simmons dismissal, who we should note is a Whitmer appointee?
Yeah, I think there are many political implications here. You already have Nessel coming out and making the case that this is a bad sign for the upcoming 2026 election. Basically sends a signal to anyone who might try to interfere, go ahead. You have sort of an invitation to do so. And she's also making the argument that judges across the country might be fearful when it comes to these 2020 election-related cases to rule against Trump allies. Notably, the judge in this case said that while there was not sufficient evidence of criminal intent when it comes to these Trump electors, she said basically, the Trump campaign isn't off the hook here. We don't know what the criminal intent was of the Trump allies who were apparently involved in this effort to create an opportunity to potentially overturn the results of the 2020 election. But sort of stepping back a little bit and taking a broader view of this case and how it fits into the 2020 election, which is now 5 years ago, a lot of time has transpired. Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting just to see how these various efforts to hold Trump-aligned actors accountable have shaken out. I mean, there are still some pending matters like Sidney Powell and the other lawyers involved in that lawsuit to overturn the 2020 election. They still have cases before the Attorney Discipline Board in Michigan. And then there's this voting machine case with Trump allies who allegedly tried to seize voting machines and tamper with them. So there's still some loose threads there from the 2020 election.
Beth, what, I guess, legally speaking, litigation-wise, what can we expect next?
Well, the Attorney General said yesterday that she is contemplating whether to appeal or not, in which case this would go, I believe, to an Ingham County Circuit judge, and they would decide whether this decision was made correctly or whether there are any issues with it. I think from the defendant's point of view, I mean, Representative Matt Maddock, who is married to Michonne Maddock, who is one of the defendants in this case, he came out of the courtroom saying, this isn't over. We're going to sue Nestle for malicious prosecution. So I think you can probably see some litigation in that sense at some point in time. You know, the timing of all of that, either an appeal or civil litigation against the Attorney General, I think that remains to be seen.
And we should point out that the Republican-led State House Oversight Committee has been holding hearings. We could certainly expect this to be fodder for those proceedings.
Yeah, in fact, I believe there's going to be a hearing next week on it, is what Representative Angela Regas told me.
Well, let's move from one courtroom to another. This court also on Tuesday, hearing arguments over the 9 bills that the Republican State House has refused to send to Governor Gretchen Whitmer to sign or veto. Before we talk about what happened in the courtroom yesterday, where you were, Clara and Rick, Clara, can you remind us about these 9 bills that were passed in the last session?
Sure. So these were bills that were passed when Democrats held majorities in both chambers. Typically, when bills pass both chambers, they head to the governor's desk. But in this case, that mechanical process of presenting the legislation to Whitmer never happened. And these bills would essentially make 4 major policy changes, would increase public employers' contributions to employees' health insurance costs, allow corrections officers to participate in the Michigan State Police retirement system, and protect public assistance but from debt collection, and finally allow Wayne County to levy a millage to fund history museums in Detroit. So those are the 4 policies at issue here. And the reason why this is now before the Court of Appeals is because a lower court judge ruled that while the House violated the law in failing to present the bills to the governor, the judge stopped short of ordering the House to present the bills. So it's now to sort of figure out what to do next. But in the meantime, as we're sort of in the middle of this budget impasse, there's sort of the ghost of the last legislative session hovering all over this entire fight here of this new era of divided government.
What are the Senate Democrats looking for here?
So they're looking for the Court of Appeals to uphold that legal argument that there is a legal duty here for the bills to be presented to the governor, but also arguing that the Court of Claims erred in its decision not to order the bills to be presented. So they're looking for a court order that actually has some oomph and some force behind it to make sure that these bills land on the governor's desk.
You brought up something a moment ago that I really want to dig back into, and we're going to talk about it coming up next, too, when we talk about the budget. But many in Lansing say that withholding of these 9 bills at the very beginning of this legislative session really created what we see now in divided government, this frustration or unwillingness to work together, that this was sort of the first strike that turned things bad.
Yeah, I think House Republicans would argue that it was former House Speaker Joe Tate who failed to get these bills across the finish line. And there are questions about why these bills weren't transferred to the governor before the new session started. But yeah, I mean, I think Representative Matt Hall, a lot of times when you ask him about why they're at such an impasse with the budget, he'll usually in some form of answer say, well, Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brink sued me, when I was just days on the job. So I do think it was not an auspicious start. And I think it's interesting to see the judges sort of quandary in all of this too. And they mentioned it yesterday is for some reason these bills weren't transferred. But now the question is, under what timeline should they be transmitted? Does the new legislature have a responsibility to transmit them? But then the next question that I think is making a lot of judges uncomfortable is, should they order the legislature to transfer them to the governor?
Exactly. I mean, Rick, I want to turn to you actually for a second, because you have been covering the courts and the legislature for a very long time, and this case extensively. And what's really important to note here, as you have noted in your reporting often again, is how much judges dislike having to make rulings that have to do within the legislative branch's operations, separation of power.
Separation of powers. This is a tension that goes back not just to the dawn of Michigan history, but to the founding of the Republic, the Marbury versus Madison case, where courts had to rule that courts can rule on what the government can and cannot do. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those tension points where Judge Seema Patel said, well, I'm not going to weigh on this, even though the Democrats would win on the merits. And here you've got the appeals court facing that exact same question, which is, how far are we allowed to push another branch, in this case the legislature, without invading their independence?
Which, in the end, depending on how this all turns out, could end up going all the way up to the Supreme Court. Quickly.
I think it will.
Okay, we're going to save this tape. Quickly, though, Clara, I've got to turn to you and just ask $1,000,000 question. Do you think anyone will ever know on the record why these 9 bills were not sent to the governor by her fellow Democrats before Republicans took over the House?
This is like the legislative murder mystery.
With the candlestick in the House chamber.
Lansing clue.
It's a mystery. I mean, certainly no one on the record about what happened here. It's been interesting to sort of note who has really been banging the drum on these 9 bills and who hasn't been. Notably, Governor Whitmer hasn't been demanding every day that the bills be sent to her. But she is also trying to navigate working with the divided legislature and maybe wants to stay out of the partisan bickering. So certainly a lot of conjecture around what may or may not have happened. The general feeling in Lansing is just, it's fishy.
One of the questions that came up in the court hearing is, if this is such a big deal, why hasn't Gretchen Whitmer weighed in on it?
I think that's a good question, Rick. And I would also put this out there. Anybody who has information about what occurred, my phone line is open. And we are very curious about that. We've asked a lot of people. And like Claire said, it is very fishy. I'm given to believe it was not accidental. And I think these were bills that would have big impacts on a lot of big stakeholders. So I don't know that makes sense that they were held back if you look at some of the people involved, but I think there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered there.
Yes, there are. That is Beth LeBlanc with the Detroit News. Clara Hendrickson of the Detroit Free Press also here. So in the final minutes that we have, let us turn to the state budget, where we are now exactly 3 weeks away from the constitutional deadline to have a budget signed into law. Come October 1st, with no budget, there could be a partial government shutdown. I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record here every week, but as of now, it appears, at least on the outside, that little negotiation is happening among the principals, at least. Beth, what do we know right now about where things stand?
Well, it's not great, I'll say that. I think if we are to follow the statements made during oodles of press conferences in recent weeks, there has been an exchange of pretty nasty remarks between the legislative leaders. There's been little common ground. There seems to be an impasse in terms of road funding and what could happen there and where that money is pulled from, whether it can be pulled from the existing budget or the existing tax revenue, or whether new taxes are needed to supplement that. There are arguments about how education funding should be distributed. There are arguments over earmarks. There are arguments over FTEs and full-time employees and whether there's too many. And pretty much any fight you could pick in the budget process, they have picked. And there's a lot of things up in the air. And from what we can tell, the meetings are not going well between the budget leaders.
Claire, we know that contingency planning is going on in case of this big partial government shutdown among state departments, in the executive branch. What do we know about those plans?
Well, it's sort of a just in case measure that they're taking in the event of a shutdown, having a backup to know what will and will not be funded if there is a government shutdown. But it's sort of a routine process, especially with the clock ticking like it is. It's also an indication that the general feeling is not if a budget shutdown will happen, but how long it will last. And the last budget shutdowns we had in Michigan only lasted hours. Will this one be days? Will it be weeks? I think that's the big question here. Beth touched on a lot of the key sticking points, but the governor has repeatedly mentioned there is no budget deal without a roads deal. So the question for her is, what is she willing to give up? And then the one thing that everyone does seem to be agreeing on is that the budget has to be smaller this year between federal cuts and federal funding drying up from COVID era. There is bipartisan acknowledgement that the budget will be smaller. The question is, how much smaller?
Is it fair to say that anyone who knows whether or not there will be a state government shutdown does not know what they're talking about? Like, we don't know, right?
Yeah, hold on. Let me take apart that question. Yeah, so it is true. We don't know what could happen from day to day. Tomorrow they could strike a deal. Who knows? I think that's pretty far-fetched, but they could. But I think most of the budget leaders, they're not making promises about meeting that October 1st deadline. And in fact, House Democratic leader Ranjiv Puri, when asked what the chances were last week of a government shutdown or of them getting a budget passed before October 1st, he said it was very low. I think most people are kind of preparing for this. And for me, at least, I wasn't here for the last government shutdown, but I was here in 2019 when things went down to the wire. And it gets, even if there isn't a government shutdown, it gets very messy. Last time, the House and Senate, then controlled by Republicans, got one just across the finish line right on September 30th. Mm-hmm. And then the governor vetoed $1 billion in it because she hadn't agreed to it. And there was all sorts of supplementals that had to be made to adjust for that. So even if they do get a budget at this point, it's going to be messy.
Clara, finally, what are you going to be looking for over, I was going to say the next few days? I mean, it feels like it's, to Beth's point, every 24 hours. But what are you keyed into right now in terms of where these negotiations stand? What are you watching for?
Any movement. Just any movement. It feels like nothing has really happened since they missed the July 1 deadline. Obviously, Beth and I don't have the privilege of being flies on the wall during these negotiations, but from an outsider's perspective, it just feels like the stalemate has only gotten staler, I guess. And then with the prospect of a budget deal being reached on time being pretty dim, that's not forever. They will reach a deal at some point. Then the question is, who is going to be out there championing this as a success?
That's a great question. Clara Hendrickson, politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Beth LeBlanc, politics reporter at the Detroit News. We are so lucky to have you both at the Capitol, keeping an eye on all of this and watching what happens next or doesn't in budget negotiations. Thanks, you two.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
And Rick, to Beth's point earlier, as I said, will anyone in Lansing ever know on the record why the 9 bills were not transmitted in time to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's desk? Our DMs are open. Email us if you want to. That is politics@michiganpublic.org. And even if you don't know, we want to hear from you. What stories do you want to hear more about? Drop us a line. Again, the email, politics@michiganpublic.org. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week. Will there be a budget deal? Who knows?
Who knows?